It was a cold, gray morning in Los Angeles, the kind where the sun struggles to peek through the clouds. A young man in his late 20s stepped out of a cramped apartment, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He wasn't rich, famous, or even close to it. In fact, he was just another face trying to make it big in Hollywood, a dream shared by thousands but achieved by only a handful. This man had a name that would later become legendary: Clint Eastwood. Clint's life back then wasn't glamorous. He worked odd jobs during the day, construction gigs, gas station shifts, anything to keep food on the table, and spent his nights chasing auditions. Acting roles were hard to come by, and when they did appear, they were often small parts that barely paid enough to cover rent. But despite the struggles, Clint refused to give up. He believed deep down that one day things would change. That belief kept him going, even on days when hope felt like a distant memory. On this particular morning, though, Clint wasn't thinking about movies or scripts. His mind was focused on something much more practical: buying a car. For months, he'd been saving every spare dollar he could scrape together. Not for luxury. He didn't care about fancy sports cars or shiny new models, but for necessity. Having reliable transportation meant freedom, flexibility, and maybe even better opportunities. It wasn't just a car, it was a step toward independence. With a wad of cash tucked safely in his pocket, Clint walked into a local car dealership. The place looked impressive from the outside, with rows of gleaming vehicles lined up under bright lights. Inside, the showroom floor buzzed with activity. Salespeople moved briskly between customers, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Posters advertising deals plastered the walls, promising great bargains and unbeatable prices. Clint approached the front desk, feeling slightly out of place. Unlike the other customers browsing the lot, he wasn't wearing expensive clothes or oozing confidence. His jeans were faded, his boots scuffed, and his leather jacket showed signs of wear. Still, he held his head high as he greeted the manager standing behind the counter. "I'm looking for a used car," Clint said, his voice steady. "Something affordable, reliable. Nothing too flashy." The manager glanced up briefly, taking in Clint's appearance before turning his attention back to some papers on the desk. Without making eye contact, he replied curtly, "We don't really deal with cheap stuff here. You might want to try somewhere else." Clint frowned, taken aback by the dismissive tone. "I understand that," he said, keeping his cool. "But I've saved up and I'm willing to negotiate. I just need something that works." For a moment, the manager paused, finally looking at Clint properly. Instead of seeing potential, however, all he saw was someone who didn't fit the image of a typical customer. Clint's scruffy appearance and lack of obvious wealth seemed to irritate him. With a sigh, the manager shook his head. "Look, buddy, we're not running a charity here. If you can't afford what we sell, there's no point wasting time." Clint felt heat rising in his chest. He clenched his fist slightly, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not asking for charity," he said firmly. "I'm offering to pay for a car. All I'm asking is for a fair price." But the manager wasn't interested in listening. Growing impatient, he leaned over the counter, his expression hardening. "Listen, pal, why don't you just leave? You're wasting my time and yours." That's when things took a turn Clint never expected. Before he could respond, the manager grabbed him roughly by the arm and started steering him toward the exit. Shocked, Clint tried to pull away, but the manager's grip was firm. Within seconds, Clint found himself shoved out onto the sidewalk, the glass door slamming shut behind him. Standing there on the curb, Clint felt a mix of emotions swirling. Inside him, anger, embarrassment, frustration. People passing by shot curious glances, probably wondering what had happened. For a moment, he considered storming back inside to demand an explanation, but he stopped himself. What good would that do? Instead, he stood there silently, staring at the dealership sign above the entrance. As the initial shock wore off, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. Sure, he was mad, not just at the manager, but at the entire system that judged people based on appearances. Yet, beneath the anger, Something else stirred. Determination. Clint realized that this moment, as humiliating as it was, wasn't going to define him. If anything, it was going to fuel him. Walking away from the dealership, Clint made a silent promise to himself. He vowed to prove that manager wrong, not out of spite, but because he knew he deserved better. From that day forward, he decided, nothing and no one would stand in his way. Little did he know this incident would plant the seeds for a journey that would take him farther than he ever imagined. Clint walked away from the dealership with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw tight and his mind racing. The cold wind bit at his face, but it wasn't the weather that made him feel raw. It was the sting of rejection. He replayed the scene over and over in his head. The manager's dismissive glare, the condescending tone, the rough shove out the door. Each memory fueled a fire inside him, one that burned brighter with every step he took. By the time he reached his small apartment, Clint's anger had simmered down, replaced by something sharper: focus. He sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling as if searching for answers written in the paint chips. For hours he thought about what had happened. It wasn't just about the car or the money he'd been saving. It was about how he'd been treated, as though he were invisible, as though he didn't matter. And while the manager's actions hurt, they also lit a spark within him. That night, Clint came to a realization. He couldn't control how others saw him, but he could control how he responded. Instead of letting the incident drag him down, he decided to use it as fuel. If people doubted him, fine. If they underestimated him, even better. He would prove them wrong, not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew he was capable of more than anyone gave him credit for. That resolve became the foundation of everything he did moving forward. The next morning, Clint woke up earlier than usual. He didn't waste time wallowing. Instead, he threw himself into action. First, he updated his resume, making sure it highlighted every skill and experience he had, no matter how small. Then he called every casting agency he could think of, leaving messages and following up relentlessly. He scoured newspapers and bulletin boards for auditions, determined not to miss a single opportunity. Even when rejections rolled in, which they often did, he refused to let them break his spirit. To make ends meet, Clint picked up extra shifts wherever he could find them. Some days, he worked construction jobs under the blazing California sun, hauling heavy materials until his muscles ached. Other nights, he cleaned offices after hours, mopping floors and emptying trash cans long after everyone else had gone home. These weren't glamorous gigs, but Clint didn't care. Every dollar earned brought him closer to his goal, and every ounce of effort pushed him further along the path he'd chosen. But it wasn't just physical labor that kept him going. Clint also invested time in improving himself. He enrolled in acting classes, attending sessions late into the evening after long days of work. At first, he felt out of place among classmates who seemed more polished and confident, but Clint didn't let that stop him. He observed, listened, and practiced tirelessly. He studied the great actors of the time, watching their films over and over to understand what made them stand out. Slowly but surely, his skills began to sharpen. One day during an acting class, Clint caught the attention of the instructor. After a particularly intense scene exercise, the teacher pulled him aside. "You've got something," the instructor said, his voice firm but encouraging. "It's raw, but it's real. Keep working at it and you'll go places." Those words meant the world to Clint. They weren't just praise, they were validation. For so long, he doubted whether he truly belonged in this industry. Hearing someone acknowledge his potential gave him the boost he needed to keep pushing forward. As weeks turned into months, Clint started landing minor roles. Nothing spectacular, just bit parts in low-budget TV shows and forgettable B-movies. To some, these opportunities might have seemed insignificant, but to Clint they were stepping stones. Each role taught him something new: how to deliver lines with conviction, how to connect with an audience, how to carry himself on camera. With each performance, he grew more comfortable in his own skin, more confident in his abilities. Still, success didn't come overnight. There were days when Clint questioned whether all the hard work was worth it. Rejection letters piled up, bills loomed large, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. On those tough days, he reminded himself of the manager at the dealership, the way he'd looked at Clint like he was nothing. That memory reignited his determination, pushing him to keep going. Then, one fateful afternoon, everything changed. Clint received a call from a casting director he'd auditioned for weeks earlier. The part wasn't huge, a supporting role in a Western film, but it was a chance to showcase his talent on a bigger stage. When Clint showed up on set for the first day of filming, he poured everything he had into the character. He drew on his own struggles, channeling the frustration, grit, and resilience he'd developed over the years. By the end of production, the director approached him with a smile. "You've got something special," the director said. "We're going to hear a lot more from you in the future." Those words stayed with Clint long after filming wrapped. They marked a turning point, a moment when he realized that his persistence was paying off. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was on the right track. Back in his tiny apartment that night, Clint sat alone, reflecting on how far he'd come. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still plenty of challenges ahead. But he knew one thing for certain. No matter what obstacles lay in his path, he wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. Because deep down, he understood that failure wasn't falling down, it was staying down. And Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of man who stayed down. The small Western film Clint had worked on was released quietly, without much fanfare. It wasn't a blockbuster by any stretch of the imagination, just a modest production that played in a handful of theaters before fading into obscurity. But for Clint, it was more than just another credit to add to his resume. The role gave him something he hadn't realized he needed: confidence. For the first time, he felt like he belonged on screen. His performance might not have set box offices, but it earned him respect among those who mattered. The directors, producers, and casting agents who recognized raw talent when they saw it. Word began to spread about the young actor with the piercing gaze and quiet intensity. It wasn't long before Clint started getting calls for bigger roles. At first, these were still supporting parts, but each one brought him closer to the spotlight. He didn't complain. Instead, he treated every role like it was his last chance to prove himself. Whether he was playing a rugged cowboy, a hardened detective, or even a nameless villain, Clint poured everything he had into his characters. He wasn't just acting, he was living the moment, drawing on his own experiences to make his performances authentic. But success wasn't just about landing better roles. It was also about learning to navigate the tricky waters of Hollywood. Early on, Clint realized that talent alone wouldn't be enough to sustain him in an industry built on connections and charisma. So he started attending parties, networking events, and film screenings, places where deals were made and careers were launched. These gatherings weren't exactly his scene. Clint preferred solitude over crowds, simplicity over glitz. Still, he forced himself to show up, knowing that being seen was half the battle. One evening, at a party hosted by a well-known producer, Clint found himself standing awkwardly near the bar, nursing a drink he barely touched. Around him, people laughed loudly, exchanged business cards, and talked animatedly about their latest projects. Clint kept mostly to himself, observing the room rather than jumping into conversations. That's when a man approached him, a director Clint recognized from some of the films he admired. "Hey," the director said casually, extending a hand. "I've seen your work. You've got potential." Clint blinked, surprised but pleased. "Thanks," he replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. "I'm just trying to keep improving." The two struck up a conversation, and as they talked, Clint opened up about his journey, the struggles, the rejections, the relentless grind. He didn't sugarcoat anything, nor did he try to paint himself as some kind of underdog hero. Instead, he spoke honestly, sharing anecdotes that made the director laugh and nod in understanding. By the end of the night, Clint had not only gained a new contact but also secured a meeting for a potential role in the director's next project. That meeting turned out to be a game changer. The director introduced Clint to other influential figures in the industry, opening doors that had once seemed impenetrable. Slowly but surely, Clint began building a reputation, not just as a talented actor but as someone reliable, hardworking, and genuine. People liked working with him because he brought professionalism and humility to every job. In an industry known for its egos, Clint stood out as someone who let his work speak for itself. Despite his growing recognition, Clint never forgot where he came from. Every time he walked onto a set or stepped into an audition room, he carried with him the memory of that car dealership manager, the way he'd been dismissed so carelessly. Those memories served as both a reminder of his past struggles and motivation to keep pushing forward. They reminded him that success wasn't just about achieving fame or fortune. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than anyone, including himself, had ever imagined. As Clint's career picked up steam, he noticed subtle changes in how people treated him. Strangers greeted him warmly, calling him by name. Casting directors took his calls personally. Even the paparazzi started showing up at events, snapping photos as if he were already a star. None of this went to his head. Clint remained grounded, focusing on honing his craft and staying true to who he was. He knew that while fame could come quickly, respect had to be earned, and he wasn't willing to compromise that for anything. Still, there were moments when Clint allowed himself to reflect on how far he'd come. Late at night, after a long day of filming, he'd sit alone in his trailer staring at the script pages scattered across the table. He thought about the years spent working odd jobs, the countless auditions that ended in rejection, the nights spent wondering if he'd made the right choice. And then he'd think about the present, the steady stream of offers, the growing recognition, the sense that he was finally on the verge of something big. It wasn't arrogance that filled him during these moments. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons he'd learned along the way, for the people who had believed in him when he doubted himself, and most importantly, for the fire within him that refused to burn out. Clint knew that life wasn't fair. It never had been. But he also knew that fairness didn't determine outcomes. Hard work, resilience, and a refusal to quit, those were the things that truly mattered. And yet, despite all the progress he'd made, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that his journey wasn't complete. There was still something missing, a final piece of the puzzle that would tie everything together. He didn't know what it was yet, but he trusted that if he kept moving forward, he'd find it. After all, he'd already proven that setbacks could become setups for success. Why should this be any different? With each passing day, Clint grew, more determined to reach whatever lay ahead. He didn't have all the answers, and that was okay. What he did have was a clear vision of who he wanted to be, not just as an actor, but as a person. Someone who inspired others through his actions, who turned adversity into opportunity, and who never lost sight of the values that had carried him this far. Whatever challenges lay in his path, Clint Eastwood was ready to face them head-on. Clint's career was starting to gain momentum, but he wasn't the type to sit back and wait for opportunities to fall into his lap. He knew that in Hollywood, standing still meant falling behind. So, while he continued taking on roles, big or small, he also began thinking about what else he could do to carve out a legacy. Acting was his passion, but deep down he felt there was more to storytelling than just reciting lines written by someone else. He wanted control over the projects he worked on, the characters he played, and the stories he told. That hunger for creative freedom became the driving force behind his next bold move. One day, after wrapping up a particularly grueling shoot, Clint found himself chatting with a fellow actor over coffee. The conversation turned to the challenges of working in an industry where so much depended on other people's decisions. Directors, producers, studio executives, they all held the reins, dictating how a film would look, sound, and feel. Clint listened intently, nodding along as his friend vented about the frustrations of being boxed into roles that didn't align with their vision. "You ever think about directing?" the actor asked suddenly, cutting through Clint's thoughts. Clint paused, caught off guard by the question. Directing wasn't something he'd seriously considered before. Sure, he admired great directors, the way they shaped films into masterpieces, but he'd always seen himself strictly as an actor. Still, the idea lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. What if he could step behind the camera? What if he could create something entirely his own? It didn't take long for Clint to realize that this wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a calling. But making the leap from actor to director wasn't easy, especially for someone without formal training. Most people in the industry laughed at the idea of actors trying their hand at directing. They assumed it was a vanity project, a desperate attempt to stay relevant. Clint knew he'd have to prove himself all over again if he wanted to succeed. Determined to learn the ropes, Clint started paying closer attention on set. Instead of zoning out between takes, he observed everything: the way directors communicated with their crew, how shots were framed, the rhythm of editing during post-production. He asked questions, sometimes annoyingly persistent ones, until he understood the mechanics of filmmaking inside and out. When he wasn't working, he studied classic films, analyzing every detail to see what made them work. Slowly but surely, Clint began piecing together the tools he'd need to transition into directing. His first chance came sooner than expected. A low-budget Western film fell into trouble when its original director walked off the project due to creative differences. With no one else willing to take on the responsibility, the producers turned to Clint. At first, he hesitated. This wasn't some glamorous blockbuster. It was a scrappy production with limited resources and tight deadlines. But then he remembered why he'd wanted to direct in the first place: to tell stories his way. If he couldn't rise to the challenge now, when would he? Stepping onto the set as both actor and director, Clint quickly realized how different the two roles were. Acting required focus, yes, but directing demanded leadership. Every decision rested on his shoulders, from choosing camera angles to guiding actors' performances to ensuring the entire team stayed on schedule. It was overwhelming at times, but Clint thrived under pressure. Drawing on his years of experience, as an actor, he communicated clearly with his cast and crew, earning their trust through honesty and hard work. By the time filming wrapped, everyone involved agreed Clint had done something remarkable. The finished product wasn't perfect. It was rough around the edges, with moments that showed its shoestring budget, but it had heart. Audiences responded to its authenticity, praising Clint's ability to blend action with emotion. Critics took notice too, hailing him as a promising new voice in cinema. For Clint, the response was validation that he was on the right path. More importantly, it proved to himself that he could wear multiple hats and still deliver results. With his directorial debut behind him, Clint threw himself into expanding his horizons even further. He began seeking out projects that allowed him to flex his creative muscles, balancing acting gigs with opportunities to direct. Each new role, each new film brought fresh challenges and lessons. He learned to embrace failure as part of the process, understanding that missteps often led to breakthroughs. Mistakes weren't setbacks, they were stepping stones. But perhaps the most valuable lesson Clint learned during this period was the importance of staying true to his roots. No matter how successful he became, he never forgot the struggles that had shaped him. He remained humble, treating everyone, from janitors to top executives, with respect. On set, he led by example, working tirelessly alongside his crew and encouraging collaboration. Offset, he used his growing influence to champion causes close to his heart, lending support to aspiring filmmakers who lacked resources or connections. As word of Clint's versatility spread, doors began opening wider. Bigger studios approached him with offers to star in high-profile films, while independent producers sought him out to direct projects that pushed boundaries. Suddenly, Clint found himself juggling multiple roles, not just as an actor or director, but as a producer, writer, and advocate for innovation in storytelling. It was exhausting, sure, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in his life, Clint felt like he was truly in charge of his destiny, yet despite all the accolades and opportunities, Clint couldn't shake the memory of that car dealership manager. Years had passed since the incident, but it lingered in his mind like an old scar, a reminder of where he'd come from and the obstacles he'd overcome. Deep down, he wondered if fate would ever bring them face to face again. Would the man recognize him? Would he regret his actions? Clint didn't dwell on these questions too much. He had bigger things to focus on. But the thought lingered in the back of his mind, unresolved. For now, though, Clint kept moving forward. Every project, every role, every decision brought him closer to the vision he'd been chasing since that cold morning outside the dealership. He wasn't just building a career, he was crafting a legacy. And as he stood on the cusp of greatness, Clint Eastwood knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come. Years had passed since Clint Eastwood first stepped onto a film set as an actor, and now he was doing something few people in Hollywood could claim, excelling both in front of and behind the camera. His journey from struggling hopeful to rising star wasn't just inspiring, it was proof that grit could turn rejection into triumph. But even with all the success he'd achieved, there were moments when life seemed to circle back to its starting point, reminding him of where it all began. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clint found himself walking into a luxury car dealership, a far cry from the dingy lot where he'd been humiliated years earlier. This time, however, things were different. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his presence commanded attention. The showroom buzzed with activity, but as soon as Clint entered, heads turned. It wasn't just because of his fame. It was the quiet confidence he carried, a trait that couldn't be bought or faked. As he browsed through the sleek lineup of high-end vehicles, something caught his eye. Not a sports car or flashy convertible, but a modest sedan tucked away in the corner. Its design was understated, elegant without being over the top. To Clint, it symbolized everything he valued: simplicity, reliability, and purpose. He gestured for one of the salespeople to join him, ready to discuss the details. The salesman approached eagerly, shaking Clint's hand with enthusiasm. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his tone respectful, "it's an honor to meet you. How can we assist you today?" Clint smiled politely, pointing toward the sedan. "I'm interested in this one," he said simply. "Let's talk numbers." The salesman nodded, already pulling out brochures and specs. But before they could dive too deep into negotiations, another figure appeared. A man who looked vaguely familiar. Older now, with graying hair and lines etched into his face, he hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. It took Clint only a second to recognize him. The manager from the old dealership, the very same man who had shoved him out onto the street years ago. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension. The manager froze mid-step, his eyes widening as realization dawned. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stood there awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to do next. Clint, however, didn't hesitate. With calm composure, he extended his hand. "Hello," he said evenly, his voice steady. "We've met before." The manager swallowed hard, visibly shaken. For a split second, Clint thought the man might deny it, pretend not to remember. But then, after a long pause, the manager nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I remember." There was no anger in Clint's expression, no hint of bitterness or malice. Instead, he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "A lot has changed since then," he said softly, "for both of us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Around them, the showroom continued humming with activity, oblivious to the weight of the moment unfolding between these two men. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally looked up again, there was genuine remorse in his eyes. "I owe you an apology," the manager said haltingly. "What I did back then, it was wrong, unprofessional. I judged you unfairly, and I regret it deeply." Clint studied the man carefully, searching for any trace of insincerity. But all he saw was vulnerability, a raw acknowledgement of past mistakes. After a moment, Clint gave a slight nod. "Apology accepted," he replied simply. The response surprised everyone within earshot, including the manager himself. No dramatic confrontation, no demand for retribution, just grace. In that single act of forgiveness, Clint demonstrated a strength far greater than revenge could ever offer. It wasn't about gloating or rubbing salt in old wounds. It was about letting go, choosing to rise above the pain of the past. The encounter didn't end there. As the manager walked away, visibly moved by the exchange, Clint returned his focus to the task at hand, buying the sedan. He finalized the deal quickly, exchanging pleasantries with the salesman before leaving the dealership. But as he drove, off in his new car, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. That brief reunion hadn't been planned, but it felt significant somehow. It reminded Clint of how far he'd come, not just professionally, but personally. The young man who had once been dismissed so cruelly had grown into someone capable of handling adversity with dignity. He realized that success wasn't just about achieving goals. It was about becoming the kind of person others respected, not because of fame or fortune, but because of character. Over the following weeks, Clint found himself thinking often about that day at the dealership. It wasn't the apology that stuck with him. It was the lesson beneath it. Life is full of moments where we're faced with choices, to hold on to grudges or let them go, to seek revenge or extend forgiveness, to dwell on the past or focus on the future. Clint had chosen the latter, and it left him feeling lighter, freer. He also recognized that the incident served as a mirror, reflecting the values he'd always tried to live by. Humility, resilience, and kindness weren't just abstract ideals. They were the foundation of his success. Without them, he might have crumbled under the weight of rejection. With them, he had risen higher than anyone could have predicted. Clint knew that life would continue throwing challenges his way. Fame brought its own set of complications, and the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. But he faced each day with the same determination that had carried him through the toughest times. Every role, every project, every decision reinforced his belief that true greatness came not from external validation, but from staying true to oneself. And so, as Clint navigated the complexities of his career and personal life, he carried those lessons with him. They shaped the way he interacted with others, guided his creative choices, and informed the legacy he hoped to leave behind. He wasn't perfect, no one was, but he strived to be better every day. That commitment to growth, to learning from the past while embracing the present, defined who he was. Looking back, Clint understood that the humiliation at the car dealership hadn't broken him. It had built him. It taught him to persevere, to prove doubters wrong not out of spite, but out of self-belief. And now, decades later, standing tall amidst accolades and achievements, he could say with certainty, he had done exactly that. The encounter at the luxury car dealership stayed with Clint long after he drove away in his new sedan. It wasn't just the apology from the manager that lingered in his mind. It was the ripple effect of what had happened. That moment wasn't about settling old scores or proving a point. It was about transformation. Both men had changed since their first meeting, but Clint couldn't help but wonder how much of an impact those few minutes might have on the manager's life moving forward. Would he treat others differently now? Would he think twice before judging someone based on appearances? These questions swirled in Clint's thoughts as he reflected on the power of forgiveness and its ability to inspire change. In the weeks that followed, Clint found himself sharing bits and pieces of the story during interviews and casual conversations. He didn't do it for attention or to make himself look good. Instead, he spoke openly because he believed the experience carried a universal lesson, one that transcended his personal journey. People listened intently whenever he recounted the incident, not just because it involved a Hollywood icon, but because it resonated deeply with something everyone could relate to: the sting of being underestimated and the triumph of rising above. One evening, while attending a charity gala, Clint was approached by a young man who introduced himself as an aspiring filmmaker. The kid, barely out of college, looked nervous, clutching a worn notebook filled with ideas for scripts and stories. "Mr. Eastwood," he stammered, "I've always admired your work, but hearing you talk about overcoming rejection, it gives me hope." Clint smiled warmly, gesturing for the young man to sit beside him. Hope is important, he said. But it's only the beginning. What matters most is what you do with it. The aspiring filmmaker nodded eagerly, flipping through his notebook to show Clint some of his concepts. They were rough around the edges, full of passion but lacking polish. Yet Clint saw potential in them, the same raw energy he'd once poured into his own early projects. As they talked, Clint shared advice born from years of trial and error. Don't wait for permission, don't let fear hold you back, and never stop learning. You'll face rejection, Clint warned gently. A lot of it. People will tell. You know that you're not good enough, that your dreams are too big. But here's the thing. You get to decide whether they're right. The young man listened intently, scribbling notes furiously as if afraid to forget a single word. When their conversation ended, he thanked Clint profusely, promising to take his words to heart. Watching the kid walk away, Clint felt a sense of satisfaction. Maybe this was part of his legacy, not just the films he made, but the lives he touched along the way. As time went on, Clint continued using his platform to uplift others. Whether mentoring newcomers, advocating for underrepresented voices in the industry, or simply lending an ear to someone struggling to find their footing, he remained committed to giving back. Fame hadn't hardened him. If anything, it had deepened his empathy. He understood better than most how isolating the pursuit of success could feel, and he refused to let anyone navigate that path alone. But even as he inspired others, Clint kept pushing himself creatively. Directing became more than just a job. It was a form of self-expression. Each project allowed him to explore themes close to his heart: redemption, resilience, humanity. His films weren't perfect, nor were they universally loved, but they carried authenticity. Audiences responded to that sincerity, connecting with characters who felt real and stories that lingered long after the credits rolled. Still, Clint knew that creativity wasn't boundless. There were days when inspiration eluded him, when doubt crept in and whispered that maybe he'd peaked. On those days, he reminded himself of the lessons he'd learned throughout his career. Failure wasn't final, it was feedback. Criticism wasn't a reflection of worth, it was an opportunity to grow. And success wasn't measured by awards or box office numbers, it was defined by staying true to one's vision. One particular film stands out as a testament to this philosophy. It was a modest project, far removed from the glitz and glamour of blockbuster cinema. Set against the backdrop of small-town America, the story centered on ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. At its core, it explored themes of forgiveness, second chances, and the quiet strength found in vulnerability. For Clint, it felt like coming full circle, a nod to his own journey while offering a message of hope to viewers. When the film premiered, reactions were mixed. Some critics praised its emotional depth, calling it one of Clint's most heartfelt works. Others dismissed it as overly sentimental or predictable, but audience responses told a different story. Letters poured in from fans who saw themselves in the characters, who found solace in the film's portrayal of resilience. One letter in particular stood out. Written by a middle-aged woman battling cancer, it expressed gratitude for the movie's reminder that even in darkness, there's light to be found. Reading those words, Clint felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he did what he did. Not for accolades or applause, but to create something meaningful, something that mattered. The letter reinforced his belief that art had the power to heal, to connect, to remind us of our shared humanity. Years passed, and Clint's star continued to shine brightly. Yet despite the accolades and achievements, he remained grounded. He still woke up early, preferring solitude over chaos, simplicity over excess. Fame hadn't changed him fundamentally. It had merely amplified the values he'd always held dear: hard work, humility, and integrity. Those principles guided every decision he made, both personally and professionally. Looking back on his life, Clint realized that success wasn't a destination, it was a journey. Every setback, every triumph, every moment of doubt and clarity had shaped him into the person he was today. He thought often about the young man who had once been kicked out of a car dealership, humiliated and angry. That version of himself seemed almost unrecognizable now, not because he'd forgotten where he came from, but because he'd grown beyond it. And yet, Clint knew that growth wasn't linear. Life would continue throwing challenges his way, testing his resolve and forcing him to adapt. But he faced each day with the same determination that had carried him through the toughest times. Every role, every project, every interaction reinforced his belief that true greatness came not from external validation, but from staying true to oneself. As he sat in his study one quiet evening, surrounded by photographs, scripts, and memories, Clint allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the people who had doubted him, the ones who had believed in him, and the countless strangers whose lives he'd touched without ever knowing their names. Through it all, truth remained constant. Life wasn't fair, but fairness didn't determine outcomes. Hard work, resilience, and a refusal to quit, those were the things that truly mattered. With a contented sigh, Clint leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the fading sunset. The road ahead was uncertain, but he wasn't afraid. After all, he'd already proven that setbacks could become setups for success. Whatever lay in store, Clint Eastwood was ready to face it head-on, with grace, grit, and an unshakable belief in the power of perseverance. As the years rolled on, Clint Eastwood became more than just a man known for his films or his iconic roles. He became a symbol, a living testament to the idea that resilience and perseverance can overcome even the toughest odds. His journey from a struggling actor to one of Hollywood's most respected figures wasn't just inspiring. It was proof that success isn't handed out. It's earned through sheer willpower and determination. But what truly set Clint apart wasn't his fame or fortune. It was how he carried himself, how he treated others, and how he used his platform to make a difference. In the later stages of his career, Clint slowed down, but only slightly. While he no longer took on as many acting roles, he continued directing with the same passion and precision that had defined his earlier work. Each project felt like a labor of love, a chance to tell stories that resonated deeply with audiences. Some were historical dramas, shedding light on pivotal moments in history. Others explored personal themes, reflecting Clint's own experiences with failure, redemption, and growth. No matter the subject, his films always carried a sense of authenticity, something that came from living life fully and unapologetically. One day, while working on a film about an underdog athlete who defied all expectations, Clint found himself sitting across from a young actor cast in a supporting role. The kid was nervous, fidgeting with his script and stumbling over his lines during rehearsals. Afterward, Clint pulled him aside. "You've got talent," he said firmly, "but talent alone won't get you far. What separates good actors from great ones is preparation." The young actor looked up, surprised by the directness but grateful for the advice. Over the next few weeks, Clint mentored him closely, sharing tips on everything from voice modulation to emotional depth. By the time filming wrapped, the actor had grown not just in skill but in confidence. On the last day of shooting, he approached Clint with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'll never forget this." Moments like these reminded Clint why he kept going, even when the industry evolved and trends shifted around him. It wasn't about staying relevant or chasing accolades. It was about leaving something behind: lessons, inspiration, and maybe even a little hope for those coming up after him. Outside of filmmaking, Clint dedicated more time to causes close to his heart. He supported programs aimed at helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life, believing strongly in the importance of giving back to those who served their country. He also championed arts education initiatives, funding scholarships for aspiring filmmakers who lacked resources. To Clint, creativity was a gift, and everyone deserved the opportunity to nurture it. Despite his generosity, Clint remained fiercely private. Fame had brought attention, yes, but it hadn't changed the essence of who he was. He still preferred quiet evenings at home, reading books or tinkering with old cars in his garage. Friends described him as grounded, humble, and endlessly curious about the world. Even in interviews, where cameras captured every word and gesture, There was a genuineness to him that couldn't be manufactured. Still, Clint understood that legacy wasn't something you could control entirely. It wasn't built on statues or headlines, but on the impact you left on people's lives. And so, as he entered the twilight of his career, he focused less on preserving his image and more on creating meaningful connections. Whether mentoring, newcomers advocating for marginalized voices, or simply lending a listening ear, Clint made sure his actions spoke louder than words. Looking back on his life, Clint realized that every twist and turn, the rejections, the triumphs, the encounters that tested his character, had shaped him into the person he was today. He thought often about that cold morning outside the car dealership, the moment that had ignited his fire. Without that rejection, without that humiliation, would he have pushed as hard? Would he have fought so relentlessly to prove himself? Maybe not. In a strange way, the manager who had dismissed him had unknowingly given him a gift, the motivation to rise above. Clint didn't hold grudges. He believed in second chances, not because they were easy to give, but because they reflected the kind of person he wanted to be. Forgiveness, he'd learned, wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about freeing yourself from its weight, choosing to move forward instead of being held back. That philosophy guided him not just in his personal relationships, but in his creative endeavors as well. Every film he directed, every role he played, carried echoes of that belief. We're all capable of change, of growth, of becoming better versions of ourselves. When asked in interviews about his advice for young dreamers, Clint kept it simple. Don't listen to the naysayers, he'd say. They don't know your story, only you do, so write it the way you want it to go. Those words, though straightforward, carried decades of wisdom. They reminded listeners that life is unpredictable, messy, and often unfair, but it's also full of possibilities if you're willing to fight for them. As Clint grew older, he began thinking more about mortality, not in a morbid way, but in terms of purpose. What did he want to leave behind? How did he want to be remembered? Fame fades, awards gather dust, and box office records are eventually broken. But kindness, integrity, and the ability to inspire others, those things endure. On his 80th birthday, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues, Clint raised a glass to toast not his achievements, but the people who had helped him along the way. None of this happens alone, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Every hand extended, every door opened, every lesson learned, it all matters. I'm grateful for it all. The room erupted in applause, but Clint quickly waved it off, uncomfortable with too much attention. Instead, he turned the spotlight onto the younger generation, encouraging them to keep pushing boundaries, to dream bigger, and to never lose sight of who they were. The future belongs to you, he told them. Make it count. Years later, long after Clint had stepped away from the limelight, his legacy lived on, not just in the films he created, but in the lives he touched. His story became a reminder that greatness isn't reserved for the chosen few. It's available to anyone willing to put in the work, to face adversity head-on, and to rise above doubt and fear. And so, whenever someone hears the name Clint Eastwood, they think not just of cowboys, detectives, or directors, but of grit, grace, and the unwavering belief that no matter where you start, you can always rewrite your ending. That, perhaps, is the greatest gift Clint gave the world. Proof that setbacks aren't the end, they're just the beginning of something greater.